Glenn, thank you for meeting with me via Zoom and having a conversation.
My pleasure, Jazz. It's great to see you.
The point of these is really just to share our stories and your wisdom and share that with the church. So I might begin by you sharing some of who you are, your place, your country, where you're situated at the moment, and what keeps you busy or not busy.
I'm a bit worried about the wisdom bit you mentioned that I'd have to share. That's a bit difficult. But I'm in Glen Iris in Melbourne, in St Oswald's Anglican Church, which is, this is a fairly traditional area of Melbourne. And I'm here as, I like to call, they call me the vicar, but I kind of call myself as the artist, activist and priest. And they all seem to go together as one, and it's what makes me operate as a person and how I make sense of life out of those processes. I came to Melbourne in 2015. I'm originally, as a child, grew up in a place called Ulan, which is just north of Mudgee in New South Wales. And I spent a lot of my time a few miles south of Ulan at a place called Cook's Gap, which is allegedly a place that Captain Cook could see from his ship. And it's quite sort of ironic that I lived there in this 250th anniversary of Cook and of his influence on the impact through his bumping into Australia on Aboriginal people. So it's kind of a little quirk that I only really thought about this morning, actually. So I come from there. My grandmother was Wiradjuri. As far as I can understand, her father, it was Kamilaroi and Kalkadoon, which is a long way away. Kalkadoon's in Mount Isa, Kamilaroi's down in New South Wales, but apparently his father came down as a drover's assistant or drover's worker and took the name of the drover. So that's where I come from. And it's interesting to talk about Cook in that sense, because in that Mudgee area, within 50 years from 1825, every single tribal Aboriginal had been, to quote one of the local people at the time, exterminated. So it's interesting that you sort of, I grew up on that sense in that place, on top of the Great Divide, looking both ways at the same time, which was a really interesting kind of background.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And how are you travelling in COVID-19 lockdown?
Well, in many ways, I like COVID-19. Not that I like COVID-19 itself personally, but I like the fact that we've been able to slow down and reassess and rethink about what is and isn't important. And particularly in this 250th anniversary of Cook, I've been thinking about violence and reassessing the violence that was within us. There's no peace in the world unless you're at peace with yourself. So what's the violence and how do you do violence? So it's been this real looking inwards to develop a contemplative or a non-violent life, which is more than just meditating and omming under a tree, but it's about how do you bring non-violence into all your life. So COVID, it's changed the church here. I now have 90-year-olds on Facebook watching live streaming church who would never have looked at Facebook 6 or 8 weeks ago. Never would have thought that was something that was too dangerous. But now they're on Facebook and quite enjoying sitting at home with a cuppa watching church and participating in church. So it's changed all of that. But it's also, I think, one of the most important things for me about COVID is that it's given us as clergy a chance to be less clerical. So we've backed off and said to our lay people, you don't need to see me. You don't need to hear from me. I don't ring my people every week. I don't chase them down. I have a group. There's a group of ladies who just make phone calls when they feel like it, not on any particular roster or routine. And we're going to start dropping some wafers at home for people who want them. But we haven't, I said, you don't need to hear from me every week. You don't need to see from me every week. You've been around this world long enough. You've listened to the gospel long enough. It's all in there. This is a time for you to just draw on what's inside you. And I've been amazed. We used to have, we have people who do intercessions, and I've asked them to type those down and send them in so I could read them. And they're amazing. They are amazing. And I'm thinking, where are these people been hiding their bushel under a tree, or a light under a bushel, whatever it is, light under a bushel, and not, and we have not been giving them the space. So one of the exciting things for me about COVID is the recognition that our major role as clergy is to let our people get on with living their lives. The other thing is that when we do online church, with 400 or 500 people watching church, and some of those people watch it every week, and they don't come to church. They don't go to church anywhere, but they wouldn't miss online to church. And I think every church would have this kind of group of people. So out there are people of faith that we don't know about, and we've never known about, and we will probably never see, and that is okay. So I think, all in all, my hope, as we were talking before, was that, we would have miraculously got a new world out of after COVID finished, but I suspect it'll be business as usual. There are too many people who want to make millions of dollars out of this, and we're not. It'll go back to where everybody's rushing around madly. I notice it because I live on High Street, which is the busiest street in this area, and normally you cannot sleep very well because there's noise. But it's been great. It's been great. No cars. No cars. It's good.
Quiet.
Yeah.
So that whole concept of slow, sorry, this wasn't on the questions I sent you, so I'm going to put you on the spot. I hope that's okay. Unpack what you were saying. So the whole idea about slow being the source of renewal or creativity, so kind of connects to Sabbath and I just wonder if you might say a bit more about that.
Oh, look, I think that's very true. And I think the creativity and the capacity to go to different places happens when you have time to think about the possibility that there might be different places to go to. We're so engaged in our routines, which aren't necessarily routines, but bad habits, many of them. And we have these habitual ways of operating. Why haven't we been working from home before? Because it was habit for corporations to have big businesses and big buildings and office desks and systems, and we didn't think about it. What we've learned is we don't have to do that bad habit anymore, which was a bad habit that took down the road of cars on road, emissions, more energy being chewed up, people spreading the common flu, let alone about COVID, by being jammed cheek to jowl into buses and trains. Now we don't have, that's a habit we don't have to do anymore. And I think when people say, oh, I've got to go back to normal because I'm bored, I go, just sit with your boredom, because that's the most creative place you can ever be. Because in that boredom, and for Aboriginal people, sitting on country, seemingly doing absolutely nothing, is the most, to quote a Western word, productive thing they do. Because it's there that they hear the movements, the shifts, the sounds, see the signs, connect the patterns, and then take action. I think Mahatma Gandhi said that the will of God is intelligent action in a detached manner. So we don't become attached to the habits and the actions that we do. We don't want an outcome, we don't want a process. But we used our humanity, our humanly thinking capacity, intelligently, not to gain something, just to do what is the intelligent thing to do. And perhaps I was hoping that at the end of COVID, that's what would happen, that we would, we would do this intelligent action in a detached manner. What was the right thing to do without falling back into what makes us feel good? It's the ego self against the true self. The ego self says, I want to be seen, I want to be noticed, I've got to be here, I've got to be busy, I've got to do this. Where the true self says, oh, no, it's okay. I don't have to do those things to be noticed. I only have to do the things, as Gandhi says, or I only have to do things as Aboriginal people. When there's absolutely nothing else you can do something. But, only then.
Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, sorry.
It's gold. It's gold. I just want to sit and listen. Yeah, I guess from there I'm taken to, if we did leave our office buildings more and did work from home a little bit more and had the capacity to step outside, to feel land under our feet, our bare feet. By the way, that's what I've been loving working from home, is not wearing shoes. What would we learn from that? Like, what would we learn from land? Like, if we did sit in our boredom or supposed boredom, and what could come of that?
Look, I'm constantly in trouble because when I go to the studio, which is across the road from the church, from the vicarage under the church, I walk across bare feet. And I walk across and in and out of the church in bare feet. I don't always get applauded for that, but for me, it's a very important part of connecting and feeling. And even though around here it's all concrete, but there is this sense of being freer and being attached and being a part of it. I think that, if you could imagine getting out of all of our offices, what would that do for homelessness? What would that do, because they could be transferred or converted into places for people to live? Our housing issues could be addressed simply because we work from home. And I know that's a step too far for some people, but I think that's one of those things that we could be seriously thinking about. We could be thinking about, why are we putting refugees in offshore camps when we could be putting them into office blocks that we're not using anymore as offices? There's a whole lot of things that could come out of us starting to feel what is here. And for Aboriginal people, country takes in not just the dirt under our feet, but the air, the wind, the trees, the animals. If we could just be, you mentioned before about our dog being, a monk, your dog being a monk, always in meditation. If we could only just sit and get our head around what that means for us, if we could just look at a tree and go, why is that tree alive in such a treeish way that it doesn't have to be anything else? It doesn't have to be busy doing anything else. It doesn't have to contemplate why it would be better to be a rose than to be a gum tree. It's just happy to be a gum tree. And I think that's part of what could happen if we were to be able to get out and to see, and see the patterns, how everything's connected. So you start to understand why when you have a bad mood, other people's got a bad mood. Why you make a decision about how you buy your products, it impacts upon other people, and you do violence down the line. So you'll start to put those patterns together. Aboriginal people are pattern people. We look for patterns in everything. all the patterns are the same, but every pattern is different. And you have to find a way to understand what connects. And I think that would be part of what would happen if we could just slow down as people and learn enough is enough. And we don't need all this. You know, I was reading about a certain billionaire today who could become the Australian's first trillionaire. What is that about? What is that about? And we all go, but he makes a lot of jobs for Australians. He could pay for us all to have a living wage for the next 20 years. I mean, you know, and not have all this stress and all these people living on the streets homeless. You know, what is it about that one person is allowed to have, you know, all the lollies in the lolly jar and nobody else can get their hand in? So I think we need to stop and think about some of those things. And, you know, he could pay the mortgage for all the people in Australia, and they wouldn't all be homeless as a result of COVID-19 and businesses going broke. You know, I find that rather offensive. But that's the kind of things we could start to think and work through.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
And when people listen to this, we'll be in National Reconciliation Week. And
Yep.
So all of the things you've already said, you know, have so much relevance to reconciliation, like the idea of patterns and harmony and things fitting together and making a whole. What's your view on reconciliation? What are your thoughts? How do you feel about National Reconciliation Week?
National Reconciliation Week, I think, you know, got potential because it's a time when we can actually focus non-Aboriginal people on the issue of reconciliation. Reconciliation Week is fine as long as we shift it past, well, we've done that week of the year, next time we'll do, you know, some other week. National Reconciliation Week, I'm concerned that this year we have the slogan that, you know, we're all in this together. And as I was saying to you before, in COVID, that was the slogan as well. And Aboriginal people, 50 and over, were told to stay at home because they're high risk. But non-Aboriginal people weren't told to stay home for being at high risk until they were 70. Are we, in fact, all in this together? The reality is that we are not all in this together. There are some people who have life of privilege and capacity to do things inside of COVID in life, you know, go off and stay at their holiday home while they're in lockdown. Whereas other people are not in that place. They're sharing their house in a remote community with 13 other people, and there is no possibility of social distancing. So I'm concerned about the slogan in that sense. Are we actually, in fact, in this together? And the reality is that we're not. So National Reconciliation Week is fine as long as it forces us to make some constructive changes that moves us closer to actually being all in this together. I mean, the issue, you know, I think one of the questions you asked is what is my hope for reconciliation is to really deal with this white fragility, white blindness, you know, the inability to see. You know, what are we doing in a country like Australia, celebrating 250 years of Captain Cook, when we know what the outcome of that was? And they all go, oh, well, it's not Captain Cook's fault. Well, no, it's not Captain Cook's fault, and we're not blaming him. But what we're saying is when he sneezed, this is what happened. The virus went around the country. And we're still suffering from that. So it's this white blindness, and it's the white propensity to stop people from having a voice or the capacity to have power. We still don't have statement from the heart. We still don't have a voice. We still don't have the capacity to be heard and taken seriously in the church and outside the church. You know, providing we're in the church and we remain compliant Aboriginal Christians, we're fine. But the moment we begin to speak with a voice and say no, we're not so fine. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know who decided on the slogan. They're probably regretting it now because of COVID, but National Reconciliation Week has possibilities if we are prepared to do the will of God, as I mentioned, Gandhi said before. Okay? Intelligent thinking with in a detached manner. Okay?
That's good. Thank you. So in relation to, you brought up statement of the heart, from the heart. And I wonder, a few years ago when we worked together in Melbourne, we had a fortuitous conversation in a hallway at a conference. And all conversations with you are fortuitous, by the way. I learn a lot. But one of the things you said is, how could we as the church lead the state on this? Like, how can we as the church lead this process that is recommended in Statement from the Heart? Can you say something about that?
Look, I think the church has missed the greatest opportunity to place itself at the centre of the nation when it didn't and hasn't acted fully on the Statement of the Heart, institutionally and locally. When our incapacity to place Aboriginal people, whether they are Aboriginal clergy, Aboriginal parishioners, or Aboriginal elders, inside and at the centre of the decision-making processes of the church, that the failure to do that keeps us sidelined and marginalised. One of the key things is that if you're not heard, you don't exist. And for Aboriginal people who are working through the complicity of the church with the genocide of their culture, is that they need to see Aboriginal people being Aboriginal in the church. Being Aboriginal, being able to speak and say, no, you can't build that church there because that was something or rather sacred. You can't use that kind of language in this space because this is a gender diverse space or a particular gender space. You have to think about that. You have to start to include. That's the first thing. And when that begins to happen, then we get to dealing with the truth telling about what happened in various places and how some of our saints in our own systems are not such seen by Aboriginal people, and Bishop Broughton would be one case that comes to mind. And there are others, and there are plenty of them. And we need to look at those and start to say, what do we do to make the church and churches safer place for Aboriginal or people who identify as Aboriginal people to go into. Many of our cathedrals, and it's not the present church's fault, this is, but many of our cathedrals and large churches have plaques to people who probably wasn't as nice to Aboriginal people as they should be. And that's being polite. And so we need to think about how we decolonise those kind of places to make life easier. And then we now need to start to think about how we do allow that truth-telling to occur, come to an agreement on how. The treaty thing is about agreeing that these things happen and how do we move forward. And then there's the reparation issue. How do we give back to Aboriginal people something that significantly recognises their loss? If we sell a church, 15, 25% goes to the local people. I know I've just upset a lot of folks with that one, but we need to think about that kind of stuff. free rent for Aboriginal people to use Anglican facilities, free access to ground. I don't know. These are all things that would need to be addressed, but we need to start to take that process. And if we started to do those kind of things, that kind of statement of the heart action plan, we would have go a long way to resolving some of our past sins, gain some valuable collateral with the Aboriginal people, and give an example of what's possible, and the world doesn't collapse, and the roof doesn't fall in, and the sky doesn't fall down, and we all still live together.
And you're an artist.
You're going for some safe ground here, are you?
Well, it's recognising your valuable time, and I'm wondering if you might, and hopefully this relates to what you've been saying, because it's all part of your expression of your artistic expression. I'm wondering, you've been working on a particular artwork through COVID-19 that you have been telling Brad and I about. So wondering if you might share it with the broader audience and tell us a bit about it.
I will send you so that you can put up here for them the piece of art that I'm talking about, but it's called COVID 1770. What happened when Cook sneezed? And all art, regardless of who does it, is political. Even the most beautiful of art is political, because it speaks of what the artist sees in society and what sees as what is valuable. So it's a political statement from the artist. Even if it's a beautiful scenery, there is an understanding of that ethos or aesthetic is politically appropriate. So all the art that I do has this social justice, political kind of approach to it. The piece that I've done, as I said, is COVID 1770. You might get a look at it there. It has down in the bottom corner a statuesque form of Cook, kind of like in those island statues, and he sneezes. And out goes the sneeze across Australia, and you have these COVID shapes or virus shapes, the big red blots, which are the outbreaks, the massacres, the destruction of people, country, culture. And in the middle there is a cross, which is made out of impasto, which is a medium you use to give body to paint. But instead of putting colour in it, I just put it on straight as it is. And then you have this, underneath it, there is a whole lot of black lines where there used to be life moving around, and we've imposed the cross on top of it. And it says the complicity of the church. Now, people will say, well, not every missionary was bad. No, this goes back a lot further than the missionaries. This goes back until the 11th century, when the kind of connection between imperialism and the church, both were after world dominance in many ways, one economically and the other spiritual, in terms of religion. So this goes way back. It's not just the individual missionary. So then it goes, so it follows right across the painting. It's got rows of white virus up and down it with yellow lines, which means that we can somehow kind of tame this, but we can't eradicate it. We can contain this virus, which continues to impact upon Australia now. And I know, again, that's very controversial, and there'll be people who are very uncomfortable about this kind of idea. But it's, again, getting back to the truth-telling we have to have, and the fact that we have to face some of these facts. Not to feel guilty about them, not to feel like it's your responsibility. You only have one responsibility now, and that is to help us to get it right going forward. History, we have to look at it in that detached manner.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Mm.
That's going in the Blake Art Prize, so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Amazing. So then you said we have one job going forward, and that's to help you move, the gap to close, I guess.
Yes.
Can you share one or two pieces of wisdom about how we go about that as the non-Indigenous population?
Wow. I think we go back to the statement from the heart. We take that seriously, and we pull that apart and think through how we can make those things happen in our own particular places. I think we move from a kingdom idea to a kingdom idea, drop the G, because that's a significantly Aboriginal concept, because we live in a custodial ethic with our kin, which is everything in creation. So it's not about building a kingdom, but it's about building a fair and equitable kingdom where we're all engaged together, and no one has more power or right or wealth than others. So this kingdom idea, I think, is a process that we have to start thinking about. Words matter, because words act. Elizabeth Johnson, the Catholic feminist theologian, says, words act. When you hear words, you act out of those words. So I think there's another massive process that our church in Australia has to do, is to become Indigenous to this space. Not Aboriginal, but Indigenous to this space, and change the language of the church. Jesus changed the language of the Jewish world when he arrived. It's not something that hasn't been done before. And I take him as a pretty good mentor. And I think it's time we started, and that was part of what I wrote in my last book, and it's part of what's in my next book, is the fact that we have to really be brave enough to let go of language that is not Australian language, not Indigenous to this place, doesn't have meaning in this place. Australians have never been, well, I shouldn't say never been, but in recent years have become less and less kingdom kind of people, and more Australian, egalitarian, better at doing those things. We've got away from, when I grew up, everybody was going, as a child, everybody was wanting to go home to the old country, going home. We're not doing that now. So we should activate ourselves and start to think about a language for the church, a language for liturgy, a language for understanding the Bible that is grounded in the bare feet of this place, in what surround us, And I often refer to Jesus as a man of two places, two countries, his father's country and his mother's country. And he brought with him the traditions and the values and languages of both places, and was faithful to both of those. Okay, he didn't come to get rid of the law; he came to fulfill it. He was faithful to the language of both places, and somehow we have to do the same thing here in Australia. And I think that's one of the big things the church has to grapple with, not fighting over whether we are liberal or evangelical, or whether we have high church or low church. That's somebody else's argument. That's not Australian, and that's not where we are. That's not where we live. We need to have a different understanding.
Thank you. And I wonder, as we close, if you might pray for the church, for us, for, you know, our journey together.
Okay. God of holy dreaming, as we gather and live on this country, in this place, may we listen to your dreaming, be open to the songs sung, the dances danced, the pictures painted, the sounds of all our cousins, those preachers who live and share this place with, so that we may find a way to walk together across this bountiful land of enough. It has always given us enough, and it always will. We ask that your tribal person, your tribal man, Jesus Christ, remains with us as our elder and our guide through the power of your creating spirit. Amen.
Amen. Glenn, it's always a privilege to have a chat with you. I learn a lot, and I look forward to listening to this again and continuing to learn. I think we'll continue to speak. It's lovely to catch up.